I can't wait. Thanks for having me back. I'm so excited to be here. Hello, my name is Ben Green. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a huge freaking nerd. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And I love it. I want to take a second to talk about what queer books mean to me and what queer writing has done for me. Um, I was always a reader for a long time, was a big Percy Jackson kid, was a big She Who Should Not Be Named kind of kid. I was in that. I loved reading. And then, like a lot of people, high school English and college homework killed my love of reading for a while. And then I transitioned. I became a speaker and an advocate, and I knew that I loved books, I wanted to get back into it, but I didn't know what was possible. And so in 2020, I just moved to St. Louis. I had very little community. I didn't know what was out there in the world around me. And my family, as a birthday present, got me a private browsing session at what I now know to be a popular queer bookstore in St. Louis called Left Bank Books. And I went into the bookstore, and there were five people in my whole browsing appointment. And the other four people went in, bought their books, and bugged out. And I had an additional 90 minutes booked in the store with me and the booksellers. And so I was spent the whole time working out my courage, and then I went out to the front desk and I said, "Hi, I know this might be a weird question, but is there such a thing as a science fiction or fantasy book that has a trans protagonist? Does that exist?" And I was so nervous, and the person that was at the front desk started to kind of chuckle and laugh in a vaguely TV supervillain kind of way. And I was like, "I'm sorry, you can forget that I asked." And she was like, "Buddy, everyone who works here is trans." And so then my friend Danielle and the other three booksellers who were there brought me down to the basement, which is where they keep the science fiction and fantasy, sat me down in a chair, and proceeded to spend the next 90 minutes giving me a mind-boggling education in the world of queer and trans science fiction and fantasy. They sat me down, they piled me up with stacks and stacks and stacks, literally running around the store, running up to me being like, "Ben, here's this one. Okay, the next person. Okay, here's this one. And this book is gay people in space. And this is gay cowboys. And this is transgender romance." And it was so chaotic. And I went home and I read all of them. And I was like, oh my God. I didn't know they put us into books. This is unbelievable. And so I started connecting to my own identity. I started connecting to my community. I fell in love with reading and with writing and with queer books. And so now I write queer fantasy books as well as queer and trans nonfiction books. I've found so much of myself and my home and my community through that bookstore and that moment. And that's the experience that I want to replicate with you all today. Queer books taught me how to build the world that I want to live in. And they taught me that I was not alone in it. And so I want everyone to get to experience that feeling. So let's talk about it. Let's get nerdy. Okay, let me get my slides going. Where are they? Here they are. Can everyone see this okay?
Looks perfect to me.
Beautiful. Okay, so what queer science fiction teaches us about survival? Now, real quick thing I want to say, a lot of this is going to be me talking about many of my favorite books and different categories of queer science fiction and what we can kind of learn from those categories. So I want to hear from you all of what these categories mean to you. If I mention a genre of queer literature that you're like, "Oh my gosh, yes, that's my favorite," put your recommendations in the chat. Give us a pitch and say, on this topic, here's the books that I would recommend to everybody, because there are so many books in all of these buckets. I've chosen to highlight a few of my favorites, but they're not the only ones or even necessarily the best. They're just the ones that I've seen. So please add your book wisdom to this conversation, because all of us have things to add and things to share in this conversation. I'm just going to put up my pretty little monitor so that starts behaving itself. We'll see if that works. Yeah, it does. Okay, amazing. So, queer science fiction. So, why do we read? What's the value in stories and queer characters? There's a quote from Octavia Butler, one of the most pioneering liberatory authors of this universe. She said, "I never bought into my invisibility or non-existence as a Black person. As a female and as an African American, I wrote myself into the world. I wrote myself into the present, the future, and the past. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about queer science fiction. And there's plenty of things in the queer fantasy world as well. Today's conversation is going to be a lot about sci-fi and speculative fiction, which is this imagining. And I think no one could say it better than Miss Octavia Butler, which is that we are using science fiction to imagine a world that is better, to understand the role that we play in the world we're in now, and to recognize where we've come from and to heal. So I've broken our conversation today into three categories of what science fiction empowers us to do. It empowers us to imagine something better, imagine a world that is radically different. It empowers us to invite more people into that world with us, right? The quote that I will always keep coming back to is Tony Cade Bombara. The role of an artist is to make the revolution irresistible. We are going to be talking today about how science fiction builds a world that allies or people who might not get anything about queer and trans people see what world we're fighting for and understand what freedom might feel like and what beauty that could bring. And then how science fiction allows us to heal. There are a lot of really heavy, shitty, scary things happening in the world around us. And science fiction can give us a safe container to process those feelings and to know where to go and what to do with those feelings, as well as how to heal from terrible things that have happened, from generational trauma. How do we find that community building? So we're going to start with part one, which is imagination. Queer books allow us to see a future with ourselves in it. When I got to that bookstore for the first time, I wasn't just struggling with making friends in my community or figuring out what job I wanted to do in a new city. I was struggling on a much more fundamental level to imagine such a thing as a future with me in it. That was a skill as a trans person that I did not really have. So queer characters in these science fiction and fantasy stories do a couple of things. Sometimes people read sci-fi, speculative, and fantasy books because we want an escape from the real world stressors that we have. And when we include queer characters in those escapes, we remind ourselves that we're not trying to escape from our queerness, right? My queerness isn't a problem. I love being trans. My life is not worse because I'm trans. My life is worse because of politicians who hate that I'm trans. I want to escape them, but I don't need to escape myself. So being able to bring our whole selves into this joyful escape, and then seeing normalized diversity reminds us that things aren't supposed to be this way, right? One of the things I love the most about science fiction is how frequent it is to have totally radically different norms around gender and sexuality. And it's almost a trope in science fiction for conventional gender roles to be like a joke, to be like, oh, it's so weird. You know, when we encounter aliens, they love to say, like, sorry, and you're saying that all the girls wear pink? That is so weird. That normalized diversity, where when we think of the future, we think of the future as synonymous with radical acceptance and normalization of queerness and gender fluidity and openness, that does amazing things to our brain. To understand that we are walking towards a world where one day this is not an issue. This is totally normal. That's how things can be. And seeing ourselves in those stories, even just as background characters or messy characters, or even complicated or evil or angry or pained characters, is an amazing way to normalize our view of ourselves in the world around us. So I'd love to hear from you all. What was the first book where you really remember seeing yourself, whether in your queerness, in your transness, or in other parts of your identity, disability, or race, or religion? Where did you see yourself for the first time? And feel free to share it in the chat. I know for me, the answer was Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. Seeing a trans mask protagonist learn about music and or magic and grappling with what masculinity and femininity meant to him, that was mind-blowing to me to realize that trans men get to be heroes too. That shit was the best. Oh, I see the chat is popping off. Rye, do you have an answer to that too? Not to put you on the spot, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to share. I think that for me, I mean, especially, I think a lot about this book. This is like one of my favorite books for sure.
yeah.
But I think that maybe one of the ones that really had an impact on me before I read this novel was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi.
Yeah.
Akwaeke Emezi and just their writing style is so amazing and phenomenal, and the way that they perceive and interpret their transness as like a spiritual practice and like godlyhood almost. Like it's something that
Yeah.
feel it was really impactful for me as a trans person who also feels like it's a spiritual practice too. And it was Pet by Kweke Mezi, where it was such a simple line where she's like a black trans like selective speaking girl, and her first words were saying like girl, like I'm a girl essentially, and then the dad just being like, oh sorry, we didn't know. And like one of the next lines was like they never treated girls like her, they didn't treat girls like her the same way as they did in like the old world. It was just like such simple lines of like the dad was immediately like, yes, like, you know, we didn't know. Here, we're here to help you just like transition, you know, like we're here to see you as your full authentic self. And like these girls weren't treated the same way in the old world. It's like the simplest sentence in like a speculative like future
Yeah.
visioning world, you know?
And that's such an amazing like form of imagination is like what could it look like if it was totally normal, if it was easy, if it was as obvious as anything to say, cool, we didn't know. We love you. Thanks. I love that. I love Pet. And the prequel to Pet, by the way, also amazing speculative fiction called Bitter about the role of artists in the revolution. Huh. Beautiful, beautifully done. Seeing some great ones in the chat too, some that I know and some that I don't at all. Um, seeing Left Hand of Darkness, I love. We'll be talking about that. Picnic on Near Side, I don't know. Oh, Rye, do you want to say the Fierce Femmes title again?
Yes, fierce femmes and notorious liars. I'll type it in the chat.
Amazing. Yeah, I love, and for some of us, we're early on that journey, right? Maybe you're joining right now and realizing there might be a book out there where you feel seen. And I'm really hopeful as we go through. I have so many books recommended today, probably 25, that represent such a wide range of identities and experiences and backgrounds. So hopefully something sticks out to you as, wait a second, am I in that book? Do I get to be the hero of this story? Or do I get to, see myself in that story, even if it's a anti-hero kind of situation? So that's my dream. So when we talk about envisioning the future, obviously we have to start with one of the most common forms of envisioning the future. Nnedi Okorafor. Yes, I love so many of her books, and I wish they were more queer because I was always trying to think of like how can I put them into this, and they didn't make it into this. But Nnedi Okorafor does amazing Afrofuturism writing, and I love the Binti series is a top one for me.
I agree that Nydia Corfor's characters can be more queer.
Yeah,
I
they
was so excited for them to get to that point, and then they weren't. I'm like, okay, you know, that's okay.
She's doing a lot of amazing stuff. We can make it a little fruitier. We'll get there though. Okay, so if we're thinking about imagining the future, it would be impossible not to start at one of the themes that dominates science fiction, which is dystopia and revolution fiction. There are so many, if not infinite, books about total dystopia, about total societal overthrow or societal collapse. And one of the things I love about the queer approaches to books about dramatic change and total collapse or changes that take place over centuries is that they remind us how many different forms that change is going to take and what it's going to look like. And they portray them in ways that's really messy and remind us that it's not just going to be, an easy, quick, perfect switch. And these stories also include regular human stories of people living their lives, people having hobbies, people building families, people falling in love, reminding ourselves that while it might feel like everything around us is falling apart, and I know that's sometimes how it feels right now, we also will continue to live. And so a lot of these books, some of my favorites are Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin and the Broken Earth trilogy, A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. That's a really neat one that not enough people have heard of. That is essentially this giant spaceship that has recreated the social statuses of the antebellum South. And someone decides to start, after a really terrible incident with a guard keeper, starts a revolution in the kind of bowels of this spaceship. The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin is also a really beautiful, deeply messy book about the kind of what comes next. It takes place about 170 years after a successful revolution where a group of anarchists have built their ideal world on a desolate moon, and ask questions like, in a completely egalitarian and equal society, what is the place for somebody who is brilliant or exceptional? What is the place for academic study? How do people handle relationships and marriage? And there's a line in that book that I really love that said, "You cannot buy the revolution, you cannot make the revolution, you can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere." Um, I just finished reading that book actually last night, so it's very present in my heart. And Ursula K. Le Guin, who we're going to talk about again in this presentation, is one of the leading authors in writing us towards a better future, in envisioning for decades. The Dispossessed came out over 50 years ago. For decades, she wrote about what could the future look like in really radical ways. And so there's something really beautiful in queer revolutionary stories and in queer dystopian stories, but there's also more than just collapse and bad news, right? Some of these books are also really heavy and really stressful to read. So there's a genre that has emerged that is one of my favorites that is either called solar punk or hope punk, kind of like steampunk, except really kind of interwoven with this radical climate futurism that is a combination of technology and hope and environmentalism and green space. Solar punk and hope punk paint a picture not just of a better world that is post apocalypse or has nothing to do with the apocalypse, but show slices of life in a world that is radically different. And it doesn't have to mean that every single thing is fixed, but it means that there is something better out there and we can see ourselves in that. It gives us the ability to exercise that muscle of not just viewing the world as a permanent downward slope, but that whatever happens, we can return to build something kinder, softer, more beautiful, even within the cracks of a really aggressive or hateful society. So, Upright Women Wanted, for example, is an amazing story about non-binary revolutionary librarians in the wild, wild west. They basically run around distributing banned books, and it is an incredibly hope punk book. It is badass, it is fiery. The catchphrase of the book is "Fight the state, be a librarian," which I think is very accurate to present day as well. So it doesn't have to be that everything is perfect. It can be we can build something beautiful, even in a world that is oppressive. Monk and Robot is one of my all-time favorite duologies. The two books of A Psalm for the Wild-Built and A Prayer for the Crown-Shy are essentially about a world post-apocalypse. So there was a dramatic technology apocalypse. They were making all of these robots work in the factories, and one day the robots just walked off into the woods. And then they said, we needed to totally rethink the way we do technology and develop significant restrictions and built a solar punk society. And then a robot emerges from the woods to meet this non-binary T-monk and says, the robots decided we wanted to check on humans. How are you guys doing? What does humanity need? How have things been since the rift? And so they travel around talking to people about what it means to take a break and find peace and what humanity needs. I try to read that book at least once a year to slow me down. And it just reminds me that we can build something beautiful. Sometimes things might fall apart. Some systems might collapse and might have to be rebuilt in a totally different way. And solar punk inspires us to think about things totally differently. And then Light from Uncommon Stars is also just a personal favorite. Hopeful, warm, found family, which we're going to talk about a little more later. Just this beautiful book about a trans femme violinist signing a deal with the devil. Also a donut shop, a romance plot line, and like deciding to be different, deciding to live differently. I absolutely love these. And solar punk inspires real and meaningful change around us, as does revolutionary fiction, right? There's a reason that people write these books. It's not just because we want a distraction. Revolutionary fiction inspires people to make real change in their communities, as does solar punk. Here are a couple of my favorite examples of solar punk in real life. This is a Taipei baseball stadium that was turned into a soccer stadium, and they were deciding if they wanted to just demolish it. And they decided instead to turn it into a community garden. And so they transformed this whole stadium. In some ways, it's falling apart, but it's also never been more alive. There are also people who are in the society of what's called OBOD, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, which is a real, like, global community of people who follow nature and want to protect natural beauty and magic. For some people, it's a religion. For others, it's a social gathering or a way of getting connected with their community or their spirituality. Um, and then there's a really cool climate futurism book called What If We Get It Right? That is just radically dreaming of better futures. So science fiction gives us the tools and the safety to imagine these futures without someone immediately saying, well, here's why that wouldn't work. Here's why you can't do that. Because it's a world with, robots and flying cars. You have to suspend your disbelief a certain amount to engage with the story in the beginning. And then we get to imagine and really play with what could it look like? What is a better world going to look like? And I think that's really neat. I think that's really fun. Yeah, I'm loving the Light from Uncommon Stars fans. I am a big fan, and we're going to talk about coziness quite a bit. I'm loving all the book recs in the chat. Please keep them coming, keep rolling. Oh, Catherine, I see you have your hand raised. Yes, are you able to talk on here, or are you a participant? Oh, I'm realizing that
I
I'm
don't
not
believe you'd be able to talk, but if you want to, yes, it looks like
on. Oh,
Catherine said that you're
here.
there.
Okay, no
If you have
worries.
anything you want to share, feel free to share it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk about part two now, which is how we use science fiction to invite more people in, right? I am a public speaker, which means that I spend all my time talking to people about how we can make a world that's better. And I have lots of different kinds of events. I have events to talk about books. I have events to talk about poetry. I have open mics. I have storytelling events. I write books. And it is so much harder to get people to show up to a political theory and strategy conversation than it is to say, read this science fiction book, right? There's something so amazing about the ways that these stories connect people to this movement or maybe bring their walls down a little bit versus if I come in and just say, here's why you need to care about trans rights. That's hard for some people versus putting a book in front of them that gives them something to think about, something to learn about, and places to ask questions, right? The goal of an artist is to make the revolution irresistible. So there are a couple of ways that science fiction brings new people into the fold. Um, One of the things science fiction does is it makes a mess. It makes things confusing. It asks weird, complicated, frightening questions that people feel more comfortable engaging with when we're doing it through story. So, for example, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. I told y'all you're not going to get away without me talking a lot about Octavia Butler. She was a mother of Afrofuturism. She did so much work talking about apocalypse and faith and community building and mutual aid. And so she wrote the Earthseed duology that was set in post-apocalyptic Earth that's falling apart. It's about climate change and social inequality, wealth disparity and corruption, and a young girl deciding to make it better. Deciding to build a community based on mutual aid, to really radically dream of a new religion and new ways of relating to each other. In real life, she couldn't have just said, well, let me start a cult. Let me tell everybody I'm dreaming of a new religion. Here's how it's going to impact, wealth disparity. That wouldn't have reached nearly the millions of people that the Earthseed books have reached. Um, Chuck Tingle also has a book called Bury Your Gays that has a really weird, messy, complicated conversation around media representation of LGBTQ people. People talk a lot about the bury your gays trope and the dangers of it, but that's an academic conversation. People aren't always engaging with that, especially people outside of the queer community. But suggesting a creepy, funky, unique horror story, that brings a lot more people in. Ursula K. Le Guin has a phenomenal book called The Left Hand of Darkness that is also messy and weird, that talks about essentially an explorer who travels around different planets, and it's a whole series. And so in The Left Hand of Darkness, he arrives at a planet where people's biological sex regularly changes. Sometimes it changes based on mood or based on time of year or mating season that they're in. And so this guy who's from a planet where that does not happen has to figure out, how do I relate to these people if I don't know what their gender is? And he ends up on a very long voyage with just one person who has their biological sex shift throughout their journey. And he's figuring out how to relate to that person. And she again wrote that book over 50 years ago. And it was weird, but it reached people. It made people ask questions about their own identities, about how would I relate to the people that I loved if their biological sex was less consistent or if I didn't know that about them. It's amazing. So science fiction gives us the ability to ask questions like who gets to be human in the case of Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, or in the case of The Genesis of Misery, asking the really sticky question, who gets to be sane? What does it mean to be seen as sane, and who does not get that privilege? What does it mean to be the Messiah, to be a chosen one, to be an outcast, to be all of those things at once? Genesis of Misery it's pretty fucked up. It's a great book though, but it is super weird. So how does science fiction make a huge mess? I love messy, messy books. Um, Science fiction also encourages people across generations. It wakes them up. It radicalizes us in a lot of ways, right? Octavia Butler, because again, I'm obsessed with her, has done so much to inspire dreamers and revolutionaries after her to get involved. So there's this phenomenal book called Octavia's Brood that is kind of a funny name because Octavia Butler has a book called Lilith's Brood that's a collection of short stories. Octavia's Brood is a collection of short stories written by people who were inspired by Octavia's work to become storytellers, to become activists and revolutionaries. And it's this amazing series of stories dreaming of a radical, liberated future. Janelle Monáe, inspired by that, wrote her own short story collection called The Memory Librarian. That's also an unbelievably gorgeous collection of dreaming of a liberated, queer, Black future. As did N.K. Jemisin, who wrote the short story collection How Long Till Black Future Month, which is a series of Afrofuturist and queer futurist stories about a totally different world. So connecting with these storytellers, allowing yourself to be really inspired, and then creating something and keeping that movement going. Queer science fiction is the through line between so many generations of revolutionaries, right? Because a lot of times people become activists often despite their parents' wishes, right? My dad's an investment banker. Like he's not a revolutionary. He's a nice guy, but he's not showing up to tear down the system in the ways that I am. My ancestors are these dreamers. My ancestors are the people who fought for a better world, who told stories about what they were dreaming of. And I want to pass that along through my own storytelling, not just to my own kids. So, how are we continuing that chain? I also want to talk about one of the most popular genres of science fiction right now, which is this concept of cozy sci-fi, cozy fantasy, and in particular, the trope of found family. We can't possibly talk about queerness and queer books without talking about found family. And there's a reason this trope is so popular, but I think it's actually a little bit of a misnomer. I don't think these stories are found family as much as they are built family. And I have some fan art from one of my favorite series, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is a fan art of the crew of a ship, excuse me, that's going to make essentially a delivery. And most of the story is just about their journey from point A to point B. It's very slice of life, very cozy. And the people on this ship have chosen each other. They don't often get along. They're from a really wide range of cultures. They disagree, they argue, they step on each other's toes, they fall in love. They have built this really beautiful family because they chose to do that. They didn't just encounter it. And I think a lot of us really are drawn to found family stories with this feeling of like, I wish that I had that. I wish that I had this people, this community that loves each other so deeply and so truly. And one of the opportunities I want us to have of thinking about what science fiction really teaches us about how we survive right now is that we're not going to just encounter a perfect family, especially if we try to build a family that is completely homogenous, of all people from our own background, from our own community that exactly agree with every single thing we believe in really perfect ways. As a queer community, sometimes we hold a really, really un unmountable high bar to each other to say, can you be a part of my found family? When we then go and read these books that often have tropes of the grumpy person who everyone disagrees with, and the person who's kind of a silly, lovable dope who doesn't know what's going on, and the person who's bossy, and the person who's really, really smart but really shy. These families choose each other and they learn how to navigate their differences and they learn how to love each other and they build their families. They figure out how to communicate. We don't have to view found family as fiction. It happens to take up a really big role in the fiction stories that we read, but that's because authors know that we are craving it, right? I love to write found family into my stories, and I love to really specifically explain, and this is how we choose these families. This is how we build them. This is what it looks like to make a mess with each other and then find forgiveness and find conversation. So if you're reading these books feeling like, I wish I had that found family, we can build that too. That is not the fictional part of these stories. The spaceship adventure doing a delivery, that's the fictional part. That people have learned how to get along with each other across differences, that doesn't have to be fiction. A couple of my other found family books on here that are some favorites. The Stars Too Fondly, criminally underrated. Amazing sapphic romance on a spaceship that's basically launched by accident by a girl who's just exploring around with her friends. Love that book. Gideon the Ninth is an amazing found family that really leans very far into the like, this is a hot mess disaster, and we all kind of hate each other, but we love each other, but we're codependent, and who knows what. And the Murderbot Diaries is also sounds a lot more gruesome than it is. It's mostly just a robot who is very introverted and shy and very non-binary and doesn't understand how to relate to other people, but really wants to understand how to relate to other people and doesn't understand why people don't like this robot. So also a phenomenal found family series. There's quite a few books. It's kind of like a little soap opera. Um, so I want to pause because I know I've thrown a lot at you, and I think I saw someone raise their hand. Was that an accident, or does someone have something that they want to add, either in the chat, or I think I'm not able to get you off mute. But oh, someone said I keep my exoskeletons to myself. We'll be coming back to that. Bones Beneath My Skin. I haven't read that one yet. I've read some other TJ Klunes. Some I liked more than others, but there were definitely, I love Under the Whispering Door. Yeah, a lot of great ones there. Um, okay, I want to switch gears now and talk about part three of this presentation, which is how queer science fiction teaches us to heal. We're being wounded all the time by a world that is hostile, by a world that has a lot of things that are really hateful and painful, by interpersonal relationships where we're let down, or moments where we feel so angry or hurt or afraid that we don't know what to do about it. And that's really hard. And queer science fiction gives us a safe container to process these feelings. So sometimes our emotions are just too big. They are overwhelming, and we're not exactly sure what to do with them. We might not know where to put our grief or how to heal from our pain or how to say, I'm furious. What do I do about that? I tend to think of my emotions as like raw ingredients that I want to know what to do with them, right? My anger is like a bunch of raw eggs. I need to know what to make. I need a recipe. I need somewhere to put them. I can't just keep throwing raw eggs at stuff because it might help me in the moment, but in the long term, my house is just going to smell like rotten eggs. I want to know how to process the things that I'm feeling. So storytelling gives us a place to maybe recognize and name the big feelings that we're having, to process those, to turn them into action steps, and to heal from trauma, both personally and generationally. Um, so I want to start with a couple of books that I think are really beautiful in talking about grief. The Deep by River Solomon, I think, is one of the most devastatingly beautiful stories. It's a very short book about healing from generational trauma and finding a place for your grief. Essentially, it is an alternative fantasy science fiction story about the number of people who were being brought over from Africa to become slaves in the colonized United States and would jump or fall or be pushed off of the boats and would drown. And it was really, really painful piece of history. And essentially, River Solomon turned this into a story and said, what if those people became mermaids? How would that community heal from those origins? And so it talks about how within this mermaid community, there are certain people whose only job it is to hold that pain for everyone. Everyone else forgot what their origins were, and a few select chosen individuals held on to that pain. And then once a year, there was a ritual where everyone would come and share in that pain, and then they would have it wiped clean from their memories again. So they would leave with the emotions, but without having to carry that still. And it's a really raw, beautiful book about how we process grief communally rather than just individually. Lake Lore is also an amazing story of generational trauma and two kids who grow up in a lake together and are kind of called back to that lake. And I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself is about grief and pain and fear, being watched by a government and losing a child and losing a partner. And it's a really painful book, but it sometimes watching other people go through their own healing journey or experience their own pain connects us to them in a way that allows us to process our own pain along with them and not feeling like we are going on that journey by ourselves. In addition to grief, a lot of us are also feeling rage right now. And sometimes books give us a constructive outlet for rage fantasies that are going to do not much in real life except for get us in trouble. So Andrew Joseph White, I saw a whole bunch of recommendations for this in the chat earlier. His books are gross. They are very cool. They are very disgusting. This is the only one I have been brave enough to read so far. Hell Followed With Us is allegedly a young adult book, late young adult, about trans kids who are tired of being on the front lines of being called monsters and being treated terribly by Christian nationalists. And they decide to take the fight into their own hands and basically fight back and become the monsters that they're making them. It's pretty graphic, but it talks about rage. It talks about how we process rage in community, where we put that rage, and is a safe container for honing that into what do I want to do about my anger. Godly Heathens, I'm only part of the way through, so I can't give a fully accurate recap, but is very similar. If you want to make me into a monster, fine, I'll show you what a monster is. And The Future by Naomi Alderman, I love this book. Is a really interesting, if you're really angry about tech billionaires, this is a very good book to read. That's what I'll tell you about that. If you're mad at Mark Zuckerberg, that is the book for you. Science fiction also gives us places to invite softness, right? Sometimes we do just want to escape. We don't want to read a book that is about the same challenges that we are facing in our everyday lives. So I have a couple of favorites that are really just cozy and gentle and remind us to slow down. I have a piece of fan art here from Psalm for the Wild Built, which I know I've already talked about once, but is absolutely my favorite book, so I'm going to keep talking about it. That says, "No matter what, I'm wonderful." Just an absolutely beautiful piece of art with our non-binary T-monk learning how to take a break and our robot learning how to look at the world through fresh eyes and slow down and really lean into awe and wonder. Can't Spell Treason Without T. This is the only other fantasy book that has made it onto this list because it is just so cozy, so queer. Huge fan of Can't Spell Treason Without T. And then a graphic novel on a sunbeam that, full disclosure, I have not read yet, but I told my bookseller friend that I was doing this event, and she told me that if I didn't include this book, then a series of graphic bodily threats that I'll bleep out of this event. But I absolutely needed to include this book. It is very high up on my TBR. I'm waiting for it at the library right now. I'm on the hold list forever, but get to it eventually. And I've heard nothing but amazing things about the art style in this book and about how cozy and warm and slice of life it is. So queer science fiction can show us what it looks like to slow down and remember that even when so many crazy things are happening, it doesn't mean you don't exist. It doesn't mean that you only exist to be in the fight, to be on the front lines and trying to make a difference. You're also a person. Have hobbies, have community, have love stories, have little dramas, go for a walk, have a cup of tea, slow down. This is a marathon, not a sprint, and more than a marathon because I don't even really think there's a finish line. We are on a very, very long walk towards the world that we are building. We've come so far already. We have so much further to go. There will always be more we can dream of. There will always be further we can go. But it's okay to walk slowly and take our time and notice that there are moments that we are exhausted and notice that moments that we are afraid. But we just keep walking because forward is the only option. So, a last couple of reminders of key takeaways from this conversation about what these books teach us, what queer science fiction takes us, and then we'll go into a little more Q&A and casual discussion. Things queer books teach us. One, we want to imagine a better future with ourselves in it. I really love kind of slice of life queer science fiction because it makes it much easier for me to imagine myself in those situations. A lot of people use words like liberated future, words like liberation, words like revolution, and they mean it in a vague kind of sense that they're here to be on the front line, they're here to throw their bodies down, but they're not actually here to reap any of the benefits of what they're trying to build. They're not actually here to be a part of the day to day of a world that is kinder or better. Um, so imagining that future with yourself in it, imagining what your whole life might look like, both while we're in that moment of overhaul and change and revolution, and what it looks like on the other side. We also want to make the revolution irresistible. When we talk to people about why we want them to join us in the fight for a better world, we can't just say because it's the right thing to do, because trans rights are human rights. We want to help them understand that a world that is free for some of us is more free for all of us. And a world that is free for all of us benefits everyone. When I talk to men, I don't just say, I need you to be a feminist because the women in your life deserve it. I sit and I talk to them about the ways that patriarchy keeps us all trapped, keeps us all isolated, stops us from having meaningful relationships with our friends and even with our partners or our own families. I talk about painting a picture of a world that is better for all of us, and I use storytelling to do so. I also want to remind us that the things we crave from these stories don't have to be only science fiction. Read these stories, read books, especially hope punk and solar punk, that tell us what could the world be, what are we dreaming of? And as you sit with those stories and you feel in your heart, this is what I want, this is what I am fighting for, I want you to figure out what of those things are actually already possible if I choose to live my life in a different way, right? As an example, one of my favorite scenes that I think about all the time is from The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, when they take a visit to one of the main character's home planets. And her society, she comes from an alien race that's kind of like lizard snake people. And they have a very different way of talking about family structures. Their families are incredibly communal. The kids have relationships with so many different adults, and it is a totally different way of thinking about family building. And I would read that all the time and think, God, that's amazing. I wish we lived in a world where my future kids could have relationships with all kinds of adults around them. And then I realized that, it's not the fact that they're aliens that allows them to do this. It's not the fact that they have, light speed spaceship travel that allows them to do this. It's the fact that they are choosing to do this. And sure, in this book, it is societally normalized, it is much easier. But if I read that and my heart pangs for a world in which my kid gets to have trusting relationships with a variety of adults, I can choose to build my life in that way. I can choose to build a community of adults who will be a part of the village for my child. And there are so many ways I get to learn from the relationships that these characters are having in the worlds that they're building and bring that into my own life. There's a character who's finding a lot of slowness or has a really nice morning routine or is learning how to take a break. I can do that too. That's not supposed to be the science fiction part. We can dream of something better and start living like it's already here. And then the last thing I want to remind us is that we want to make space for all of our feelings, but come home to joy. I am a very joyful person. I'm one of the most joyful people that I know. And it's not because I have my head stuck in the sand. I am a community organizer. I'm a political advocate. I spent the last 5 years in Missouri going to the state capitol every single week to testify on behalf of trans kids and their families. I promise, I know it doesn't feel good right now, but I'm joyful because I choose to be that way. Now, joy is not a superior emotion, that you are a bad person if you're really angry or you're doing something wrong or failing if you're really stuck in your grief. But it's important that we know that while these emotions are so critical, right? Anger lets us know when something cannot be accepted, when a boundary has been crossed. Grief lets us know when something has been lost, when something has changed dramatically, and we need assistance to heal from that. These feelings teach us lessons, but we can't build a home in them. I understand why it is to be angry. There are so many reasons to be angry. There are so many reasons to be tired, to be grieving, to be furious, to be numb, to want to give up. I get it. But look to these stories. Find the ways that they show us that anger is a sword that you hold by the blade, right? So many of these stories show us what happens when you hold on to that anger for too long. It's not good. It's not something that's certainly not good for us as humans. It's not good for our relationships. It's not good for our longevity. And we're building a better world, and I want you there. So I want us to keep coming home to joy. I want us to keep finding that softness and finding the balance between making that space for all of our emotions and coming back to this place of, I am choosing to imagine a better future. I am choosing to imagine a robust and diverse future and a found family that has people who are grouchy, who are not perfect in their language, who I disagree with, but who I love because this is a built family. So don't forget to make space for that and build those communities. So, with that, I will formally thank you all for joining me. I'll put, if we want to talk about in the chat, either questions that are on your mind or queer book recommendations you think that everyone needs to read. And I'll share my contact information up here as well. If you want to read more about hope, I have a free newsletter called Good Queer News, where I talk about the things that bring me joy and hope every week. I have a book called My Child is Trans, Now What? In case you have a trans kid in your life that you love and want to be better at loving. And I have an email if you want to be my friend. If you want to be friends and talk about books, just because I'm doing a webinar doesn't mean that I'm like an inaccessible, person. I'm just some guy, and I'm always looking for queer friends to talk to about books. So please be my friend. Thank you for being here. This has been so fun. And I'm gonna open the floor for anything and everything that is on your hearts, on your minds. What are your favorite books? What do you want to know about? Also, if it's like tangential and you just want to know, how does a queer book apply to a thing that I'm extra afraid of right now, or surveillance, or, whatever the heck. I just like talking about books and trans rights. So anything that intersects with either of those, you can ask me about.
Yes, thank you so much, Ben, for all of your love and your passion and your heart just poured into this and all of the book recommendations. I'm like, can you share that slide deck for me so that I could share this out to
Yes,
folks?
please send
Yeah,
it out far and wide.
amazing. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, anything that they want to say to Ben, I'll leave the floor open for a minute or two, so get your questions in before we close off.
Um, Oh, there's a book that I have not read that someone just put in the chat. Any discussion of queer science fiction is severely lacking without a mention of Isabel Falls. I sexually identify as an attack helicopter. It is a fascinating look at the interplay between gender and the society that constructs it and uses it to enforce hierarchy through a futuristic lens. Well, I will be reading that shit immediately. That is cool. And I'm putting that on my Storygraph account ASAP. Because I agree. I think that sounds really good. And I love reading from people who are at all spots on their transition journey, who are in all variety of gender identities. I have so much to learn from the ways that non-binary people relate to gender, from the ways that trans femmes relate to gender, even from the ways that other trans mascs relate to gender. It's amazing how much we can learn from each other, and the ways that we can use science fiction to make it extra weird, and extra, a safe container to ask really strange questions. I love that.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, all of also just, yeah, in the chat, so many
I
different
know.
recommendations too. Keisha asked, are there queen books?
Ooh, I am not 100% sure what that means.
Very curious about what you mean about that.
Yes, if you want to elaborate, Keisha, I am happy to talk about um, there are definitely a lot of books that have like queer and trans royalty in them. Witch King by H.E. Edgman has a very cool like trans person in line for the throne who really doesn't want it and is very good drama. Also, a graphic novel called The Prince and the Dressmaker is a very cool trans femme graphic novel, romancy. It's YA and it's really wholesome, and I love it. The Prince and the Dressmaker. Um, I'll give it an additional like 30 seconds to see if Keisha has any additional clarifying thoughts on the question. Um, Oh, are there queer books for trans folks? Yes, absolutely. There are so many. And I think if you go through, the whole list of things that I talked about in this, so many of the books in this presentation feature trans protagonists in particular because I'm trans and I love a trans book. Yeah, a lot of these I'm looking back at them are very transgender. One of my favorite books that is like deeply queer and trans is Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, um, about a like I don't know exactly what their gender identity is, but basically person who develops the ability to shapeshift between genders and does so kind of for fun, which is super weird, and I love that book. Um, yeah, there's a lot of fun, weird, queer trans books. That's a great question. I love that.